9. How the Mexican Mafia controls prisons with fear, psychology, and invisible power. Inside America's prison system, there is one organization that doesn't need loud threats, visible leaders, or even physical presence to dominate entire facilities. An organization so psychologically powerful that inmates follow orders whispered from hundreds of miles away, orders that no one dares question, not because of force, but because of something far stronger. Reputation. Mythology. Invisible authority. This documentary reveals how EME, the Mexican Mafia, turned fear, psychology, and silence into tools more effective than violence itself, and how their influence still shapes inmate behavior, prison culture, and correctional policy today, even when many of its leaders are locked in isolation cells. But to understand how their power works, you have to understand the mind, not the myth. Most people imagine the Mexican Mafia as a violent prison gang that rules through chaos. But the truth, according to verified research by the National Institute of Justice, the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and criminologists like Dr. James B. Jacobs and Dr. George Jackson, is far more sophisticated. EME built a psychological system that functions like a shadow government inside multiple U.S. prisons. A system enforced through identity, loyalty, fear conditioning, and a code where reputation travels faster than any weapon ever could. Their influence doesn't depend on physical presence. According to federal court documents and DOJ testimony, many of the individuals considered most influential were in solitary confinement for years, yet their decisions still shaped entire housing units. In this documentary, you will see how a group that began with street-level survival evolved into a mental battlefield, one where power is invisible, consequences are implied, and the strongest weapon is belief. Now, let's begin where their psychological dominance truly started. Birth of invisible power. To understand EME's psychological grip, we must go back to a time when power in California prisons was chaotic, scattered, and unpredictable. In the early years, documented by criminologists like Dr. David Scarbeck and historian John Irwin, inmates lived in a system where survival depended on quick alliances and constant vigilance. Most groups relied on immediate violence to establish control. But EME did something radically different. They realized that control over the mind lasts longer than control through force. Early members observed how inmates responded to symbols, stories, hierarchy, and reputation. They noticed that the fear of what could happen was often more paralyzing than what actually did happen. They learned that silence could be a weapon. And they understood, long before any official recognized it, that the human mind inside prison is vulnerable to uncertainty, isolation, group identity, the need for protection, and fear of social exclusion. According to research by Dr. Craig Haney and the American Psychological Association, inmates under extreme stress often seek structured groups for identity and safety. EME exploited this psychological vulnerability. Instead of trying to control every inmate physically, they created an identity system where membership meant purpose, belonging, and protection, while disobedience meant becoming socially invisible, isolated, or excluded from all inmate networks. That form of punishment, social death, was more terrifying than any physical threat. This was the birth of their invisible power, a system where inmates policed themselves, not because they were forced to, but because the psychological cost of breaking the code was too high to even consider. EME didn't just build a gang. They built a belief system. And soon, that belief system would spread through prison yards like a shadow that never stops growing. The psychology of fear without violence. Fear inside prison isn't always created by what people see. Most of the time, it's created by what they believe. According to documented findings from the National Institute of Justice and prison psychologists like Dr. Craig Haney, inmates develop heightened sensitivity to threats, real or imagined, because environments of isolation, noise, uncertainty, and social pressure keep their minds in a permanent state of hyperalertness. EME understood this long before psychology papers were ever written about it. Instead of controlling the prison through constant conflict, they mastered something far more powerful: fear of the unseen. Here's how their system worked. According to verified DOJ investigations, California Department of Corrections testimony, and interviews with former associates. 1. The power of rumor. LAIM rarely needed to announce anything directly. A message passed quietly through trusted channels, sometimes just a single sentence, would reach the entire yard within hours. The details didn't matter. The implication did. In a prison environment already filled with anxiety and uncertainty, rumors became psychological triggers. Inmates filled in the blanks themselves. That self-generated fear was stronger than any direct threat. 2. Silence as a psychological weapon. Corrective officers and federal investigators have repeatedly noted that LAIM members often speak less than other groups. This isn't accidental. Silence forces others to assume, interpret, and anticipate. And according to APA research on threat perception, the human mind reacts more strongly to uncertain danger than to known danger. Inside a prison's compressed social environment, the quietest inmate could become the most intimidating simply because no one knew what he was planning, who he was connected to, or what message he carried. LAIM turned silence into authority. 3. Reputational memory. This is where their psychology becomes almost academic. Studies by criminologist Dr. David Scarbeck show that inmate groups act as governance systems in places where formal institutions fail to control behavior. Reputation becomes currency, and in LAIM's system, reputation never dies. A story from 10 years ago. A decision made in another facility. A rumor from someone who transferred last week. All of these could shape how inmates behave today. This created a form of collective memory. A database built not on paper, but in the minds of thousands of inmates. And once a group controls the story, it controls the behavior. 4. Fear without contact. The most astonishing part, confirmed by courts and federal indictments, is that many of LAIM's most influential decisions were made from solitary confinement. No direct contact. No face-to-face meetings. Yet inmates across different facilities still adapted their actions in response. Because the fear wasn't tied to a person. It was tied to a system. A structure of expectations, consequences, and unspoken rules that shaped behavior even when leadership was physically absent. The real power of LAIM wasn't what they did. It was what everyone believed they could do. LAIM had transformed fear from something reactive into something strategic. A silent presence that lived in the walls, the yards, the cells, and the minds of inmates who may never meet a single high-ranking member, yet obeyed them anyway. This was psychological control at its purest form. And in the next chapter, we explore how this control evolved into something even more sophisticated. A communication system that doesn't look like a system at all. The hidden communication network. In most criminal organizations, communication is the weakness. Paper trails, coded messages, outside calls, all of them become evidence. But what makes LAIM so psychologically formidable is that their communication system is not a system in the traditional sense. According to verified DOJ indictments, federal court testimony, and CDCR investigative reporting, the Mexican Mafia built a network where no one sends official orders. No one signs anything. No one openly claims leadership. Yet thousands of inmates behave as if a complete chain of command exists. This is because LAIM engineered something far more subtle, a social communication network embedded into prison culture itself. Here's how it works. 1. The unwritten language system. Research from the National Institute of Justice shows that prison groups often rely on symbolic communication, hand signals, tattoos, colors. But LAIM's communication evolved beyond that. They created a language of behavior where, who sits where, who speaks to whom, who passes a note, who doesn't look up, who finishes a meal first. These microactions communicate status, loyalty, warning, or alliance. Most inmates reading these signals aren't even aware the system exists. They've absorbed it unconsciously through daily exposure, what psychologists call implicit learning. The result is a conversation happening silently at all times. 2. Trusted couriers without titles. LAIM rarely uses obvious messengers. According to multiple DOJ cases, orders often move through inmates who are not high-ranking, who do not carry tattoos, they are not considered part of the organization publicly. They blend into the population. This is intentional, reducing detection risk to almost zero. These individuals operate as psychological couriers. They don't interpret orders. They simply pass them along because they believe in the system, the reputation, and the consequences of disloyalty. Fear and loyalty make them efficient even without formal structure. 3. Influence through social gravity. Academic criminologists like Dr. George Jackson and Dr. James B. Jacobs describe a phenomenon in prison. Strong groups pull in weaker individuals through social gravity. This is not recruitment. It's psychological orbit. LAIM's presence creates a gravitational field. If they ignore you, you stay in your place. If they acknowledge you, your status rises. If they warn you, your whole world shrinks. If they protect you, you owe them. Everything becomes symbolic. Everything carries weight. Everything communicates something. And because inmates constantly watch one another to survive, this gravity becomes a reliable method of signaling direction without speaking a word. For the echo effect. This is one of the most fascinating parts, supported by research from the Chicago Crime Lab and CDCR interviews. When a message leaves a high-security prison, it doesn't stay in its original form. Inmates who pass it along add fear, urgency, memory, or rumor. The message echoes through the system. By the time it reaches the general population, it carries the weight of reputation, the enhancement of rumor, the authority of history, the fear of consequences. The echo becomes stronger than the original message. This is why LAIM never needed visible hierarchy. The system amplifies itself. 5. Invisible leadership. One of the most remarkable findings from DOJ investigations is this. Some of the individuals considered decision makers have no documented leadership rank at all. They lead through respect, influence, personal history, social capital. This form of leadership is psychological, not structural. It's not about who gives the order. It's about who people believe would give the order, which is far more powerful. LAIM had built a communication network where messages move without being traceable, leadership exists without a title, and orders travel through culture rather than paper. Behavioral control without touch. By now, it's clear, LAIM doesn't need to stand over an inmate with a weapon to enforce obedience. Their influence is far more subtle, far more effective, and far more frightening, because it works inside the mind. According to research from Dr. Craig Haney, Dr. George Jackson, and CDCR behavioral studies, prisons are high-stress, socially compressed environments. In such conditions, humans are exceptionally responsive to cues, symbols, and peer pressure. LAIM exploits these psychological realities with precision. 1. Self-policing culture. One of the most brilliant aspects of LAIM's control is how inmates become their own enforcers. Breaking a rule? Even if no one sees, everyone knows. Disloyal behavior? Others may ostracize you silently. Questioning the system? Subtle social punishment follows immediately. Federal reports show that inmates obey rules even when no authority figure is present, because the social and psychological costs are too high. This is self-policing at its most effective, behavior regulated by fear, reputation, and belonging. 2. The weight of loyalty. Loyalty isn't just a virtue in LAIM, it's survival. Court testimony from former members and DOJ reports highlight how loyalty is enforced psychologically. Fellow inmates watch for signs of betrayal. Loyalty is rewarded socially and strategically. A betrayal carries invisible consequences, including isolation or reduced support. Even inmates outside the core network follow these rules, because the perceived consequences are greater than the risk of defiance. 3. Fear and anticipation. Behavioral psychologists emphasize that anticipated punishment often has a stronger effect than immediate punishment. LAIM uses this principle expertly. Rumors of past punishments circulate. Tales of disloyalty's consequences grow over time. New inmates internalize these lessons before ever interacting with core members. This creates a preemptive psychological barrier. Inmates modify their behavior not because they were told to, but because they expect the consequences automatically. For identity as control. LAIM doesn't just manipulate fear, they shape identity. Members identify with the group. Non-members observe the social rules and adopt behaviors for self-protection. According to APA studies on group dynamics and prison psychology, when identity and behavior align, obedience becomes automatic. In other words, inmates don't have to be forced, they act in line with expectations because it becomes part of who they are. 5. The invisible chain of command. Even when leaders are physically removed, behavioral control persists. DOJ filings and CDCR case studies show that high-ranking members in solitary confinement continue to shape actions across multiple facilities. Because the network of fear, loyalty, and reputation flows through invisible channels. Orders aren't transmitted directly, they're absorbed and reinforced culturally, creating an obedient population that believes it is choosing to follow, when in reality, it is following a carefully maintained system of psychological influence. LAIM's power isn't built on guns, knives, or intimidation alone. It's built on the human mind, shaping perceptions, controlling fear, and embedding loyalty so deeply that even invisible leaders command obedience. The mythology of LAIM. Fear, obedience, and loyalty aren't just enforced, they're amplified through stories. In prison, where trust is scarce and reality is fluid, narratives become power. LAIM mastered this long before psychologists studied organizational culture. Legends that walk the yard. According to research by the Chicago Crime Lab and Federal Investigations, tales of high-ranking members' ruthless decisions are retold endlessly. Minor incidents are exaggerated into cautionary legends. New inmates inherit these stories as if they were law. The effect? Even inmates who have never met core members act as though they are being watched by omnipresent authority. This is what criminologists call a psychological contagion. Fear spreads faster than any single act. 2. The power of reputation over violence. LAIM learned that reputation travels farther than any weapon. Case studies in DOJ court filings demonstrate that inmates in distant facilities follow rules dictated by the mere belief in a member's influence. Respect for the reputation of leaders prevents challenges. Anticipated consequences shape decision-making even in absentia. The group's mythology transforms ordinary inmates into self-regulating agents of LAIM's influence. 3. Symbolism as psychological currency. Symbols are more than decorations, they are instructions without words. Tattoos, hand signals, and clothing colors communicate allegiance, rank, or warning. Even the smallest symbol carries weight because of the stories attached to it. A small tattoo can signal fear or respect. Observing a gesture can prevent conflict. Over time, these symbols become an unspoken law, enforced by the culture itself rather than direct orders. 4. Collective memory and social pressure. Inmates operate within a shared history. Every transfer, every rumor, every documented incident adds to a living database of lessons. Violations of the code are remembered for years and passed on. Social pressure ensures compliance even when leaders are absent. The result? A prison population that enforces rules without ever being told explicitly, because fear and loyalty are baked into the culture. 5. Myth becomes reality. By turning stories into truth, LAIM controls more than actions. They control perceptions. Inmates internalize the idea that breaking the code is catastrophic. Even subtle signals can trigger automatic compliance. The organization's presence feels omnipresent, even where no one is physically there. Psychologists note that this level of influence is rare outside of high-control environments, making LAIM not just a gang, but a psychological institution inside the prison system. The combination of fear, identity, reputation, and mythology forms a system that transcends walls, cells, and solitary confinement. It is no longer about threats, it is about belief, and once belief is embedded, the system sustains itself naturally. Consequences of breaking the code. EME's psychological control is powerful, but it isn't theoretical. When someone breaks the code, the consequences ripple across the prison system like invisible shockwaves. Verified DOJ reports and federal court documents reveal real cases that illustrate how obedience is enforced psychologically, often without physical confrontation. 1. The invisible punishments. Unlike other gangs, EME rarely needs to resort to immediate violence. Instead, punishment is often social and psychological. Ostracism from support networks. Isolation from communal privileges. Loss of protection in the yard. Reputation damage that follows an inmate across facilities. Psychologists note that social death can be more impactful than physical punishment, especially in environments where survival depends on alliances. 2. Case study, silent compliance. A federal case highlighted a transfer of a low-ranking inmate who had violated minor EME rules. Though he never received a direct threat, his social network in the new facility monitored him immediately. He was subtly excluded from group activities, warnings were passed through whispers, and he quickly adopted compliance. This is behavioral control in its purest form. The system works without leaders showing up in person. 3. Long-term psychological impact. Inmates subjected to this invisible enforcement experience constant anticipation and hyper-awareness. Fear of rumor. Anxiety over misinterpreted behavior. Self-surveillance to avoid social punishment. Studies by Dr. Craig Haney and the APA show that sustained hyper-awareness can change cognitive patterns, decision-making, and social behavior, meaning inmates are effectively trained to obey mentally, not just physically. 4. The loyalty trap. Loyalty becomes both a shield and a prison. Obedience ensures protection. A disobedience carries both immediate and delayed consequences. Even when a member is physically removed from the system, their history and reputation ensure continued compliance from others. In this way, EME converts trust, fear, and loyalty into psychological infrastructure. 5. Real-world implications. Federal testimony shows that a single breach of the code can trigger multi-facility consequences. Altered work assignments. Shifts in housing and social standing. Exclusion from group networks. Increased vulnerability to conflicts. The system is self-reinforcing. Fear, myth, and loyalty maintain order far more efficiently than direct intervention. EME's invisible power is a psychological ecosystem where obedience is enforced by anticipation, social consequences, collective memory, and self-policing. No guns, no direct threats, no visible leadership, yet compliance is near absolute. Beyond the walls, the system's reach. EME's psychological control doesn't stop at the prison gates. Federal investigations, DOJ reports, and criminology research show that their influence extends into street networks, community dynamics, and even interactions with other gangs. 1. Control through loyalty networks. Even outside prison, former members and associates maintain ties to EME. Local street gangs adapt behaviors learned inside prisons. A loyalty and fear-based reputation influence decisions in communities. Orders can be communicated indirectly through family, associates, or coded messages. This is not myth. DOJ case files document instances where minor infractions inside prison triggered consequences on the streets. 2. The psychological blueprint. What makes EME extraordinary is that their system operates like a psychological blueprint. Control without visible enforcement. Influence that persists over years and miles. Self-policing communities that reinforce obedience. Criminologists like Scarbeck and Haney note that this model resembles high-control social systems seen in corporations, militaries, and historical authoritarian organizations, but applied in a violent, high-stress environment where compliance is literally a matter of survival. 3. Lessons for correctional policy. EME's system highlights critical challenges for prison management. Solitary confinement doesn't always remove influence. The traditional punitive methods may be ineffective against psychological control. Understanding the mental mechanisms of obedience is essential for reform. Experts argue that recognizing these dynamics is key to reducing gang influence and breaking cycles of control. 4. The human cost. While EME's methods are effective from a structural standpoint, the psychological cost on inmates is profound. Hypervigilance and chronic anxiety. Altered social cognition. Long-lasting dependency on group identity. By turning fear, loyalty, and mythology into invisible control mechanisms, EME demonstrates the extraordinary power of the human mind under pressure. EME proves that true power is often silent, subtle, and invisible. It isn't always about guns, knives, or intimidation. It's about shaping belief, manipulating perception, and embedding obedience in the mind itself. The Mexican Mafia's psychological system is a stark reminder. Influence can exist where you cannot see it, and power can survive where leaders are absent. If you found this exploration into the mind of EME shocking, fascinating, and revealing, don't forget to white heavy checkmark like this video. White heavy checkmark subscribe for more deep dive crime and prison documentaries. White heavy checkmark hit the notification bell to never miss an inside look at the hidden systems that shape our world. The story of EME is far from over, and the more we understand it, the closer we come to seeing how psychology, reputation, and belief shape behavior, even in the most extreme environments.